A couple of weeks ago, rumors started floating around that Sony would be shutting down the PlayStation Store available on the PS3, PSP, and PlayStation Vita, and as of Monday, it was made official. Normally, the shutdown of digital stores for outdated consoles is an expected inevitability. It only makes sense that now that most people aren't using them anymore, their stores aren't really needed. But I believe the shutdown of the PlayStation Store is rather unreasonable, and a result of mismanagement, misguidedness, and a lack of care. Originally launched on the PlayStation Portable, with the service eventually coming to the PlayStation 3, the PlayStation Store was one of the first of its kind, although not the first. It was a necessity for Sony's devices to have a digital storefront at this point, as its competitors, the Wii and Xbox 360, both had their own. However, all three had their own different ways of doing things, though I think Sony's was the most straightforward. In its earliest days, it featured games, free demos, and movies on both platforms, with the PS3 offering digital Blu-rays, while the PSP offered PSP movies, as they were called. It was quite novel being able to demo games without a demo disc, or purchase games without going to the store, or even waiting for a package to arrive. But being such a new thing in the mid-2000s, just about anything available on the service could also likely be found at the store, and for an affordable price at that. So most people, I knew at least, still bought their stuff physically, as a digital game was still a weird new idea. However, the potential of a digital gaming storefront really started to shine through when more and more products were added that you couldn't simply find at the store, such as PS1 games, PS2 games, DLC, and smaller original titles. Most importantly, however, is that between the PS3, Vita, and to an extent the PSP, a lot of what was available was cross-platform, or at least could be purchased on one platform and played on another. This perfectly set up the service for longevity, and more importantly, to become a legitimate source of preservation. You see, the only thing I care more about than playing video games is the preservation of them, making sure all of them are available for anyone to play, no matter if they're good, bad, or even unfinished. Every game is an experience, a collection of ideas, even a part of history, and in the digital age, there's no reason why games couldn't be kept on a digital storefront for future generations to experience, especially as technology progresses and the previous generations become easier to run on modern hardware. Nintendo had a pretty good start with this. The Wii's Virtual Console offered a decent variety of classic retro titles, although it was nowhere as near as expansive as it could have been. Had games kept coming to it from then till now, it would have reached the level of a true library and offered thousands of titles, which is of course why Nintendo decided they need to start over with every new console. However, Sony was always the one to do it right, at least as well as a company could do it. That is, until the release of the PS4. This was when the stores started to go on a separate path. As with the jump in hardware from the PS3 to the PS4, there's more limitations, ironically enough. Take, for example, PS2 games were introduced to the storefront in late 2011, and by the end of its run, the PS3 ended up with around 300 of them, while on the PS4 you only have about 50. And then with the PS5, all of that is gone. No PS1, no PS2, no PS3, no Vita, and as much as that sucks, that wouldn't be as bad if Sony hadn't now decided to shut down the older store. It may seem that with its closing, most things will still be available elsewhere, either physically or on a digital store like Steam, but that's simply not the case, and even if it was, a lot of history is being lost here. Let's start with the gaming industry's favorite three-letter acronym, DLC. Now, DLC is something that I've always considered scary, not just because it's a piece of a game that is separate and sold for extra money, but more so because I always feared the day when you simply wouldn't be able to get it anymore, and the game that DLC was made for would be permanently missing content. And unfortunately, that day is finally upon us. Whenever a complete edition was released for a game, even if I didn't particularly care for it, there was a certain level of relief knowing that decades later, you'll still be able to find the game in its entirety, but the grand majority of games released through the generation weren't so lucky. There are thousands of pieces of DLC released for hundreds upon hundreds of titles between the Vita and PlayStation 3. For all that to be gone is devastating. To put it in a language you can understand, let's take Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, the fourth title in a franchise known for its fighters that hadn't seen DLC before this entry. Nintendo took full advantage of their new downloadable abilities and delivered us what would be a whole additional 7 fighters available on the eShop when everything was said and done. When the day inevitably comes when Nintendo shuts down the Wii U's eShop, characters such as Ryu, Bayo, Cloud, and others will essentially cease to exist from the game unless you bought them all before the shutdown. The same thing will eventually happen to Smash Ultimate, leaving the entry made to have the most fighters, missing some of its most notable newcomers, such as Banjo, Steve, and Joker. And unfortunately, we're just months away from that exact scenario happening to titles such as PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Even if you don't like the game very much, you have to admit that seeing a fighting game permanently lose some of its characters just feels wrong. But of course, we aren't just losing parts of a game, we're losing entire games too. The death of the PlayStation Store will officially spell the end for PlayStation's legacy content. At the current date, there's hundreds and hundreds of PS1 games and PS2 games available on the store. Sure, there's still thousands missing when compared to the full libraries, but each title to come to the shop was still a massive victory, as usually getting them onto the shop wasn't as simple as just asking. Mega Man Legends is probably the most notable example of how much work it could take to get these games available for purchase. You see, in the original PlayStation release of the game, the vending machines, believe it or not, displayed a real product on them, that being Oronami C, a popular energy drink in Japan. Not only that, but in the original Japanese release, there's a building in the game modeled after Yoyogi Animation Gakuin, an animation school in Japan. There's a woman that stands outside the building with the school's real-life logo on her apron, and upon talking to her, she'll give you the real-life phone number to call the school. With these things in the game, they couldn't re-release it as is, and you'd think the answer around this would be to simply modify the game to remove these legal issues. However, Sony had a rule that whatever released as a PS1 classic had to have an identical image file to the same game that released all those years ago. Because of this, Capcom ended up releasing the two games physically on the PSP in Japan, which obviously doesn't do much for Americans still wishing for a re-release, and it wasn't until 2015, a whole 10 years later after the store's launch, that they finally worked out the legal kinks and were able to release the Mega Man Legends series on the service. This is just one example of many. A lot of these legal hardships could be seen just by browsing the store, such as how Tomba 2, for a while, only had the Japanese version available, despite also originally being released in the US. And I don't mean the game was only available on the Japanese store, I mean that despite having an English version in existence, it was only available in Japanese on the English store. Presumably it was an issue with music licensing, as both versions had different soundtracks, but that too was eventually worked out. But those are just some examples of the hardships that were fought through to get widely requested classics back on the market. And while their re-releases did wonders for availability, it also did wonders for affordability. These games cost $5.99, sometimes $9.99, and that's a lot cheaper than $30, $50, $100, $200, or even $300. Having these games in a place where they can be found at the drop of a hat and played spending the same amount of money as a Happy Meal was just amazing. But with the incoming shutdown, the real physical versions of these games are only going to skyrocket in price due to being the only way of obtaining them legally. However, at least those titles, even if way too expensive, can be obtained at all, as unfortunately there's going to be a wide array of games you literally cannot buy anymore. With digital stores allowing an outlet for cheaper, smaller games to be released without the commitment of a AAA title, there was a crazy amount of games released exclusively to the PlayStation Store. Titles such as TXK, Loco Roco Midnight Carnival, Ape Quest, not to mention that the 7th generation of gaming was the era in which indie games really started to gain traction, and self-publishing became more commonplace, thanks to the ease of getting your game on a digital storefront rather than trying to get it on a physical shelf. As just one example, the prequel to one of the biggest indie success stories, Rocket League, was a PlayStation 3 store exclusive that has never left the platform. The prequel, known as Supersonic Acrobatic Rocket Power Battle Cars, is just one of the hundreds, if not thousands, of great or even just historically important games that will be disappearing forever without any way to obtain them legally. And that's the key word here, legally. I've been repeating it throughout the videos, saying you can't get digital PS1 or PS2 games, DLC, or digital titles legally. but you can obtain them in other ways. Dedicated video game preservationists take an insane amount of time and effort to make sure everything, or at least everything they can handle, is backed up and preserved, so when the day inevitably comes where the physical disc starts to rot or the digital store gets shut down, you'll still have a way to find and play almost anything you'd want. In taking down the PlayStation Store and all the titles it offered and giving no alternative, it proves that any corporate method of preservation is both feeble and limited. And all of this seems to be happening because of a man named Jim Ryan, the president and CEO of Sony Interactive, who went on record stating, "I can say backwards compatibility is one of those features that is much requested, but not actually used much. The PS1 and the PS2 games, they looked ancient. Like, why would anybody play this?" I don't think I have to bother dissecting this statement with how beloved these classic games have become, but this opinion of his is no doubt being forced upon us with the store's shutdown. And its repercussions go beyond losing what's already there. We're also losing what would have come to it, and it's heavily affecting publishers and developers who were given no warning of the store closing. Because of this, these small teams are being forced to either cancel their releases or crunch to get them out on time. And those who do have titles already available on the service are posting warnings all over Twitter that you're now on your last chance to buy and play their releases, without forking hundreds of dollars on eBay or just ever. The vast amount of games, indie titles, and legacy content on the PlayStation Store was something of legends, but it was the combined effort of many. It was always a major loss whenever something was delisted, such as with what happened with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but now we're seeing that happen to every single product that was available on the service. I really think this is a scenario where Sony should strongly consider reverting their decision, or at least extend the availability of what's on the service to the PS5. With how developers and publishers are only just now finding out about the closing, it's clear the process hasn't made it very far if it's even started, and the path they're going down is one that only encourages piracy and the purchase of secondhand goods, which is not how things should be. But at the moment, it looks like it's time to say goodbye to the PlayStation Store as we know it.